When a routine traffic stop it becomes a defining moment of career, the worst assumptions OFA police officer collides with the truth that he never saw coming. His target is, the man who holds your future in Hishin's sun, was beginning its descent over the streets of San Antonio, painting the sky with golden and amber stripes. Diego Herrera was returning home after a long day at the office. Sedan purred softly. So just did the air conditioning. Anxious Lido, get rid of the day's stressed radio, was playing softly in the background, a relaxing antidote against the bustling streets of the city, where approached a yellow traffic light slowing down. Just astern Reddit was then when the blue and red ones exploded behind him, accompanied by the loud roar of a Pellis Saran. Diego looked in the rear-view mirror, slightly furrowing his brow. He moved to one side of the road, rolling down the window when a patrol car parked behind from him emerged. Officer Bradley Morrison, about 30 years old with a military haircut and a badge shining on his chest. Morrison adjusted his belt, while arrogantly headed towards Diego's carafe. Diego, exuding the confidence of Samayan, used to being in controllicence and registration, said Morrison, his voice flat but with a touch of authority. Diego complied without saying a word, reaching the glove compartment for his registration, handing over his driver's license. His movements were deliberate and calm, but he could feel Morrison's gaze, scrutinizing him as if he were looking for a reason to delve deeper. Do you know why I stopped you? Asked Morrison, getting closer to the window. Not completely sure, he replied. Diego, in a uniform manner, his tone polite but firm. He did not come to a complete stop at the traffic light, Morrison said, although there was a flicker of hesitation in his voice. Diego frowned but nodded slightly. I understand. I thought I had slowed down in time. But I understand. Speed in time, but I understand. Morrison didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stayed there, his eye shelves closed while studying Diego more closely. It was no longer just a stop routine, at least not for Morrison. His posture changed subtly but notably, as if he had already disavowed this was more than a minor infraction. The officer looked at the license in his hand. It's not from around here, is it? He asked. Diego hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. I moved here a few months. My address is on Thelesense, but Morrison really didn't was listening. His questions were starting to take on a tone aggressive enough to suggest Thoth no longer cared about a traffic violation. Trafico's calm demeanor seemed to annoy him and leaned in closer. Where he was heading in such a hurry? Only I was going home, Diego replied. His tone remained steady, but the subtle change in the atmosphere was impossible to ignore. Morrison no longer saw Diego just as a driver saw something else. Something that's justified suspicions. Diego could feel the tension rising. But he didn't flinch. Morrison didn't know that the appearance equalness was not naivety. It was control. This was just the beginning. Morrison took a step back, folding the Diego's documents with exaggerated slowness before putting them in the pocket of his chest, straightened his expression, changing to something slightly arrogant, as if he had already made a decision about the man sitting in front of him. Get out of the car, please, ordered Morrison. Diego's grip on the steering wheel tightened briefly, but his fist did not betray any reaction. Is there a specific reason for that, officer? He asked, his tone measured. The Morrison's lips tightened, but quickly hid. ID asked him to get out of the car. He wouldn't want to make this harder than it has to be. Thought being the threat hung in the air, unspoken but unmistakable. Diego exhaled slowly and opened theater while leaving. Morrison's eyes scanned him, evaluating him. Diego was a bit taller than him. Officer, his broad shoulders but his non-threatening attitude. His tailored suit suggested resignation. His polished shoes indicated someone meticulous, but none of that seemed to matter. Morrison pointed towards the front from the car. Hands where I can see them. Diego carried out his movements, calmly and deliberate. Is there something specific? Titus looking for Officer Morrison smiled slightly. Just routine. We've had some incidents around here. You can never be too careful. Diego turned his head, exchanging glance with Morrison. Incidents involving men in business suits driving sedans. Or does this have more that has to do with something else? The question fell like a blow, and for a moment the Morrison's composure faltered. He straightened up his hand, drifting towards his belt. More for flex, more than necessity. Watch your tone, said, his voice hardening. I'm just asking a question. Diego replied. There was no challenge in his voice, just a firm nescient that seemed to disturb the officer. Morrison leaned in closer. His eyes narrowed. Seems to know very well how this works. Do you have something to hide? Diego let the silence linger. A moment before responding unofficially. I just believe in being clear about the reasons of an interaction like this. Transparency, Morrison mocked, but he didn't respond. He took a step back, walking in a small circle in front of the car. The dynamics were changing in ways that I couldn't fully understand. Complaudly wasn't reacting like most people would. There was no fear. There was no stuttering. There was no nervous movements. Instead, there was control, composure, and a disturbing calm. Put Morrison on edge. Seems quite confident. he murmured Morrison almost to himself, as I've thought he knew. What was going to happen after Diego didn't take the bait and Change slightly tilted his head. The trust is not the problem here. Officer respect is indeed the issue. Morrison froze for half a second before turning to confront him. The arrogance had gone replaced by something sharper most defensively. Opened his mouth to respond, but the words didn't come out. Diego's composure was unbalancing him, and he didn't like it. Walevy's silence stretched. The tension between Thee felt electric, and Morrison began to realize that this was not was going to develop as he had expected, but instead of retreating, it doubled. True test was about to begin. Morrison drummed his fingers against the holster on his belt. His barely contained frustration wasn't used to being challenged judicially, not by someone who looked like Diego. Her gaze returned to the sedan as if he were looking for a justification. That had been fabricated, yet turn around and put your hands on the hood, said Morrison, his voice sharp. I need check if he has weapons. Diego raised unabrow weapons. He repeated in an incredulous tone, but still measured. Do I look like someone who carry a weapon? Morrison's jaw tightened in for a moment. His composure cracked a dime. Not going to ask you again. Diego, a flicker of something indecipherable, hesitate passed across his facethin. Without saying a word, he turned around and he placed his palms flat against the hood of his car. Morrison approached. The crunch from his boots on the asphalt, breaking the uncomfortable silence. The officer petted Diego, with quick and abrupt movements, his hands stopping a little longer than a saucer. Wasn't just a review, it was an attempt to assert dominance, to provoke a reaction, but Diego did not flinch. He did not become rigid, not even moving under thin evasive scrutiny. It's clean, murmured Morrison, taking a step back. The admission sounded like grudgingly, as if he were irritated off, not having found anything to justify his suspicion. Diego turned to face him. His calm expression, but sharp eyes. Of course I am, he said. Simply now official. If it's already over, I haven't finished, interrupted Morrison. His voice lightly rising. Words came out too quickly, betraying her need to maintain the control. Seems to know a lot about what Ty can and cannot do. Would you mind explain why? Diego crossed his arms. His posture laxed, despite the tension sparking between them. I've had my fair share of interactions with law enforcement, said. Let's say I've learned a lot over the years. Over the years, the eyes of Morrison squinted. That's right, lawyer, or something like that. Diego smiled weakly. Or something like that. The ambiguity in his response seemed to irritate even more. Morrison got closer, invading the space, Diego's personal space, his voice dropping to almost a heard. Do you think it's smarter, Thani? Do you think you can get out of this? Speaking, Diego found his gazine, a uniform manner, without flinching. I don't believe anything official. I only believe in justice. Justice, and so far, I'm not seeing a lot around here. The words hung in there like a challenge, and Morrison bit the bait. Justice, do you think that's what this is about? People like you always stopped abruptly, the words remaining like smoke. Although it didn't completely escape, Diego's expression didn't change. Boot something in his posture shifted, a sign subtle but unmistakable that he had captured exactly what Morrison had left unsaid. People like me, Diego repeated, his voice soft but loaded of meaning. Morrison bristled, taking a step back as if he realized that he had just of crossing a line that I couldn't uncross. Do you know what I mean? He murmured. Although his tone lacked conviction that he had had moments earlier. I think that yes, Diego replied. Silently, his calm was no longer passive. It was sharp like a knife cutting through that pretense like a bloody end. I think we both know that this interaction stopped being about a traffic violation a long time ago. Morrison opened his mouth to respond, but the words didn't come out first time. He looked uncertain, as if he was completely sure how proceed. The balance of power was changing, and for the first time, Morrison was on unstable ground. But the moment of truth was still to come, and it would be one that he would never will forget. Diego's voice broke the heavy, firm, and unyielding. I think it's time. You know how I am. The eyebrows of Morrison gathered, his irritation resurfacing. I don't care who they are, he replied, although the slight crack in his tone suggested the opposite. Diego put his hand in his pocket. His low and deliberate movements. I'm going to take out my badge, he said calmly, watching as Morrison's hand tightened near his holster. There's no need for theatrics. I want that. She seized the words hanging in Thear, charged with something unspoken. The ISAF. Morrison followed Diego's hand while taking out a leather wallet and opened it, revealing a shiny badge. Diego, Herrera said. Diego, his tone so casual as if he were introducing himself to a neighborhead of Internal Affairs Division, San Antonio. Morrison froze. His eyes jumped to the plate, then back to Diego's face, searching for any sign-off that this was a joke, but there was no humor in Diego's expression. On the zeal and authority, and a touch of disappointment. Tanton Affairs, Morrison repeated, his voice break slightly. You are yes. Diego interrupted, sparing him the bother of finishing the thought. I supervise the conduct of the officers. My job is to ensure that the people that those who carry this badge maintain the integrity and the values that are supposed. A prisoner's face paled. His confident attitude, crumbling in real time, took a small step back, Hishand moving away from his belt as if weight of his own authority would have become too heavy. Suddenly Diego took a step forward, closing the gap that Morrison had created instantly do. You know what has been the most worrisome part of this official interaction, Morrison? Asked, his voice calm, but Panadaris didn't respond. He looked like Eamon, who had just realized thought he had walked into quicksand quickst and had no idea how to escape. It's not racial profiling. He continued, although that's pretty bad, it's not the unfounded escalation either. It's the fact that he has done all this without even realizing who they were speaking. Assumed that I wouldn't know my rights, that you wouldn't understand the laws, that you swore to enforce them. And why? Morrison opened his mouth, but no words came out. Words. Diego's gaze pierced him implicabus. He didn't fit into their idea of someone who deserved respect. Diego and Didupa's words were not angry, but they carried the weight of an act. That's not just a problem for me, officer. That's a problem for everyone. Those he finds in this uniform. Morrison's shoulders slumped slightly, all the weight of the words from Diego falling directly on him. Looked at the badge in Diego's hand again, as if it could disappear. I've looked too closely. Diego took a step back, giving Morrison a moment to breathe. Booth's voice didn't lose its edge. This is what's going to happen, he said. He's going to take a step back, return my documents, and think very carefully about what he says next. Morrison's lips parted. Buff hesitated, clearly debating whether to resist or fulfilling the hesitation cost him Anthon. Diego added, his voice lowering slightly, you're going to see me again. Not like a driver who stopped by the side off-road, but as the man in charge of, if he is fit to contribute that. Morrison swallowed hard, his face reddening as the weight affment was sinking. Put his hand in the pocket of his chest and took out Diego's license and registration. His hands, trembling slightly, Ash was handing them over. Diego took them without saying a word. Putting them in his wallet, he headed towards the driver's door of his car. Stopping with one hand on the handle, looked over his shoulder, finding Morrison's gaze. One last time, remember this. Officer Morrison, said Diego, the badge doesn't make him better. Thano one holds him accountable to everyone. While Diego slid back in Tohei's car and started the engine, Morrison stood still in the fading light, his shaken confidence and his future uncertain. But for Diego, this was far from finishing. His next move would spread throughout the entire apartment. They trip home was silent, but the Diego's mind was anything but that. The encounter replayed in his mind, not because it was unique, but because it wasn't. Morrison wasn't the first officer with him that Diego had dealt with like this, and knew that wouldn't be the last, but this time, things would be different this time. Diego had the authority to act. Next morning, Diego sat at his desk. The early morning sunlight filtering through the blinds of his office in the Division of Affairs Internal Affairs of the San Antonio Police Anvil was open in front of him. Officer Bradley Morrison's record was not impeccable. There were minor complaints of unprofessional conduct, professional, excessive stops, and vague misunderstandings that had never been properly addressed. Diego leaned back in his chair, his fingers intertwined as he thought about the broader implications. Morrison was an anomaly. It was a symptom of a deeper problem. Ego wasn't interested in putting a band-aid on a bullet wound. A knock on the door to his office interrupted his doubts when his assistant Carmen entered holding a stack of reports. Good morning, Mr. Herrera. Have these a summary of the misconduct case from last month? Also, Chief Rodriguez wanted me to remind him about the departmental review next week. Diego nodded, taking the files from she. Thanks, Carmen. Can you also schedule a meeting with the boss Rodriguez for this afternoon? There's something to need to discuss with him. Carmen hesitated, feeling the weight in Diego's tone. Of course, he said before leaving. Diego turned his attention to the file of Morrison, but his focus was notably on the officer. This was bigger than a man and an interaction. It was about the culture that allowed thought. Someone like Morrison felt justified in his behavior, and if there was one thing Diego knew, it was that culture started from the top. Later that afternoon, Diego sat down in front of Chief Rodriguez in a conference room. An experienced veteran with gray hair and a serious attitude, back in his chair listening attentively while Diego recounted Theotrophic's stop. I could have dismissed it as just another bad interaction, said Diego, his voice firm but resolute. But that would have been a mistake. The behavior of Morrison, it's not an isolated incident. It's a reflection of how much work we still have to do. Rodriguez rubbed his temples. Exhaling. Slowly, this is not the first time the name of Morrison appears, he admitted, but always have handled it internally. That's the problem, replied Diego. Thesalent doesn't fix anything. The silent allows it to keep happening. It's time to ban. As Rodriguez looked at him, the weight of the conversation recorded on his face. What to our propasinga? Review of the entire department's aid. Diego, without hesitation, not only of officers, but of our training, our protocols, or accountability systems. Can't keep sweeping this under the carpet if we don't demand a higher standard here. How can we expect the community trusts us? Rodriguez leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table, Are you going to bother some people with this good? Said Diego. Simply it was about time for someone to do it. Thethy. Following weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, interviews, and reports. Diego worked tirelessly collecting data, talking to officials, and holding public forums to listen directly from the community. Morrison incident, Becamia, catalyst for change. A turning point that forced the department to confront their failures. Hit Morrison, for his part, faced an internal hearing. Diego did not hide his participation. Sitting in front of Morrison, during the procedures and observing as the squirmed under scrutiny. The hearing resulted in a suspension, but Diego knew that the true victory was not in punishing Morrison, was about preventing the next one. Morrison months later, Diego stood on the podium of a community event addressing a room full of city officials. The city and local residents spoke, not of blame, but of responsibility, of the shared duty of create a system that would work for all. His words were not just a call to responsibility, was a premise of change. Justice is not, it's not just about catching the bad guys, said Diego, his voice resonating through the hall. Said trees to ensure that the people whose war to protect and serve do so with integrity, justice, and respect for all those who find it. That is the plaque and Thethet I believe in, and that is the plate we are a building here together. Applause was thunderous, but Diego stopped at it for him. This was not the end of the story, was the beginning. Of a better while, Diego came down from the podium. He looked at Thephasis and the crowd, some skeptical, some hopeful, Butavarian listening. I knew that the change would come overnight, Butit would arrive, and for now, that was in a fifth. This story resonated with you. Share it with someone who needs it. Listen to it. Let's start the conversations that matter, the ones that lead to change. Subscribe to our channel for more stories like this. Stories that challenge us, inspire us, and remind us of what we are capable of when we is right.